You have had an extraordinary life. It's far from over. I don't want to make that insinuance, but you've had so many different careers. You've been a pop star, a writer, of course, a priest, and a broadcaster. But let's start at the beginning. You grew up in Northamptonshire, a comfortable upbringing financially, I think. You were privately educated. Was it a political household? Was politics discussed much at home?
Yes and no, in much the same way that religion was. My parents were both Conservatives with a capital C and Church of England with a capital C and a capital E, but in a rather conventional form. So that meant going to church at Christmas and Easter and adopting a suitably solemn attitude of prayer when in church. And it also meant sort of going to a wine and cheese once in a while at the Conservative Association. So it was kind of formal and came with the territory. Neither of them were gingery with activism, if I can put it that way. My grandfather had been much more active in Conservative politics, and his father before him was a Liberal and a nonconformist. But the story of that was they were Liberal and nonconformists in the age of Queen Victoria, and then acquired wealth through becoming shoemakers, boot and shoe manufacturers. And as the business prospered and they grew richer, they became Conservative Church of England instead of Liberal nonconformists. It's a familiar story.
So it was the Dunn thing to be Tory, basically, in the House, and
I think so. I can remember being
debate
quite
wasn't a big
exercised
thing.
by Harold Wilson and thinking that he was a bad thing when I was young. And I remember once I had a poster of Adolf Hitler, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Where that came from, I have no idea. And I remember I altered it to make it look like Harold Wilson by having him smoke a pipe, which I thought was some biting political satire at the age of 10 or whatever it was.
God, what did you have against Harold Wilson for doing such a thing?
Well, I think because he was Labour and I knew we were Conservative, and so therefore he was bad. But that changed when teenagehood arrived.
You were a very talented musician. Obviously, you joined some groups. You were in two highly successful groups, Bronski Beat and the Communards, both reasonably sounding left-wing organisations. Fair to say you adopted some pretty left-wing politics at that age?
Yes. Well, it sort of began at school simply because the most handsome boy at school read The Guardian. So I fell in love with him and thought I ought to read the same newspaper as him. And that was what opened my eyes to the imminence of the revolution and the rightness of the cause of the left. And of course, it enabled me to become a Bolshevik in an English public school, which was a fine tradition. Enjoyed it very much. So it was nice to have something to argue with. I'm one of those, I think it's quite an English thing. I'm someone who's quite conservative by temperament, but I'm radical by conviction. And the conviction part latched onto the politics of the left. And then I ran away to London when I was 18, a gay runaway from Kettering. And that was a sort of radicalizing experience. And I dropped into London in 1980, a year after Margaret Thatcher came to power. It was a very febrile political world. And those of us who were sort of gay runaways found common cause, not just with each other, but with a whole sort of coalition of minorities and people on the left. And it seemed like it just made sense to me at the time to kind of see that as a coherent programme. And the idea was then to overthrow Margaret Thatcher, which we attempted to do by doing cover versions of 70s disco classics.
Eventually you succeeded.
Yes, I know. It was a long game, as it turned out.
May I ask, was your sexuality part of your political rebellion against perhaps your upbringing, if I can put it sort of as crudely as that? Were you rebelling against everything that you'd been taught and previously known?
I think so. I think in those days, if you realised you were gay, you also realised that the life that you were intending and intended for wouldn't serve. So you had to find a new one. And with that, that sort of came with a kind of radical revision of everything. And I began to see that as part of a wider story about an iniquitous distribution of power in society. And then I kind of, in a sort of rather half-baked way, read a little bit of political theory, although I have to say it was extremely half-baked. And I remember being surrounded by the kind of boffins of the Trotskyist left and being totally outgunned and feeling like a massive imposter, which indeed I was. And I drifted in the end towards the Communist Party in its rather old-fashioned English tweedy form, partly because they all liked nice wine, went to the opera, which worked for me, but partly also because I thought the revolution was not very likely to arrive on their watch, no matter how intently they looked for it. And I don't think I really wanted a revolution. I wasn't like things that were nasty and rough.
So did you join the Communist Party?
I joined the Young Communist League, being of tender years. And at that point, its general secretary was a very good friend of mine, a man called Mark Ashton, who was a genuinely inspiring figure, an activist, extraordinarily good fun, very fertile mind, and someone who just encouraged you to think that you could come together, pool resources, and build a heaven in hell's despair. He was a very charismatic person who died of AIDS when he was only 27, which was a terrible loss. But he did have that galvanizing effect on people around him. And there was nothing boring or preachy about him at all. He was really good fun. He worked for a while as a barmaid at the Conservative Club in King's Cross in drag, without anybody realizing that he was really from Protestant Ulster.
By my calculations, you'd have turned 18 roughly around 1980. Your first vote was Michael Foot's Labour Party at the time too right-wing for you?
Well, do you know what? Actually, I think in retrospect now, if I was going to be anywhere securely, it would have been on the left of the Labour Party. So I remember the book which I read then, which I think made the most impact on me, was Tony Benn's Arguments for Democracy. So Michael Foot and the Labour left politically worked for me, but also culturally too, because Michael Foot, he was Donnish, he was scruffy, he was a man with a big hinterland, and I sort of liked all that, I think. I was never very doctrinaire. So the Labour left in its Donnish, scruffy way was quite congenial to me.
So first vote Labour?
All my votes have been Labour in every election at every level until recently.
Well, that sounds interesting. Let's get to that. Your music wasn't overly political, or was it? I mean, at the time, it wasn't much higher than a grasshopper in trousers, but I remember it being kind of disco pop, or did I miss the political overtones?
Well, because we were chart stormers, and because Jimmy did have this extraordinary, Jimmy Summer was a singer in both bands, did have this extraordinary appeal, we went for mainstream because we thought mainstream was a good place to be. But effectively that meant that our sort of proselytizing, preaching, if you like, went on to B-sides really, because I didn't think that setting the Grundrisse to a disco beat would necessarily galvanize people into the revolutionary moment. Like lots of gay men, we were radicalized on dance floors. So for us, dance music was a sort of political soundtrack in a way. Fortunately, it was a very commercially saleable political soundtrack too. But then we had this weird dilemma, Tom, of being deeply committed to left-wing politics and proselytes for it, but finding ourselves in a successful pop band. And there was nothing that more exemplified Thatcherism, it seems to me, than a successful pop band in the 1980s. So that needed a bit of sorting out.
You were number one for 4 weeks in a row with your best hit with the Communards. How did you resolve what must have been a very lucrative career with being so left-wing?
Well, I contented myself with the model of the Champagne Socialist in the best tradition of Visconti and people like that. So that was kind of easy. Less easy was reconciling, well, for example, like lots of people who were in left-wing bands of the 1980s, I seem to remember sheltering our rewards from taxation in a way which seemed perfectly sensible then, but I think would probably seem intolerable now. But there was an irony that there was nobody sort of lefter than we were, but I think we bought a patch of forestry somewhere in Scotland, perhaps between Terry Wogan and Madness, I can't remember.
Let's move on to your mid-20s, late 20s, where you found faith. It came a little later in life. You then did a degree in theology and trained for the priesthood. That's a dramatic change of career from being a pop star. Could you talk me through how that happened?
Well, I mean, my exit from pop stardom was quite bumpy. Well, actually, it was crashing and burning in the traditional way. I mean, every pop star worth his or her salt crashes and burns on exit. But it did mean I had to sort of put myself together again at the end of that. And I'd been a chorister when I was a kid, so much of my kind of music really had its origin in singing in a choir in an Anglican chapel. So I think I must have picked up something then which said to me that what we were doing then, although I didn't believe any of it at all at the time, it was a place where you could take stuff that you couldn't take anywhere else. And when I had the stuff to take, that's where I went. So I could have went back in through a church door and found it to be more congenial than I remembered. And the more I settled in it, the more I realized it was actually my kind of natural habitat. My nephew, who's 17, he saw a video of me the other day from my pop star days, and he said that it looked like even then there was a vicar struggling to get out. And I think he's right.
What was your bumpy exit from your pop career that made you want to?
It mostly happened on the island of Ibiza in 1990. And I remember arriving and having a lovely time. I don't really remember leaving, but I think there had been quite a few casualties along the way, one way or another. And when I got back to London, I had one of those moments where you realise, oh, I've got to get a grip now. So I did. It was drugs, it was sex and drugs and rock and roll, all that stuff. But it was injurious to one's health, mental and physical and spiritual. So I kind of shifted away.
How did your priesthood change your politics, or were your politics already there and that's what led you to the priesthood? Was it a chicken and the egg question?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, there was a continuity in that I'd always been committed to an idea that all human beings are alike in dignity and deserve equal respect and opportunity and shares. So that was a Christian doctrine that I had already found my way to. What was different, though, was that Christianity insisted that I couldn't divide the world up into goodies and baddies in the way I had before. And so I started to, and what eventually realised is that the aims and the goals of faith exist beyond this world. And so politics serves up this world solutions to this world problems, but those aren't the only considerations. So my politics is now very much moderated by this sense that there is a greater good to which we should all strive and tend.
You're a member of the Labour Party now, I believe.
Well, I've just left again. I joined and then left again. I joined to vote for Keir Starmer for the leadership and then left once he had achieved it.
So that was your single reason to join?
Well, not quite. I mean, I've been a member of the Labour Party on and off for a long time, but I thought once I got ordained, I didn't particularly want to have a political commitment of that kind because I felt it might cut across the obligations I owe parishioners, you know. But I became so distressed by what was happening to Labour, the likelihood that it would never again be electorally credible under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, for whom I have no personal ill feeling at all. But I grew up in the 1980s, and the lesson I learned then was that perpetual opposition, if ideologically pleasing, is no good. And for me, the big lesson of all that was the arrival of the Blair government in 1997, which, for all its faults, seemed to me to be as good as it gets, really, with Labour. And I didn't think that Jeremy Corbyn would be someone who would be able to do something similar. It wouldn't be the same, but it would be similar. And I thought that it was important that Keir Starmer were elected leader, for I thought that he would be a leader under whom I could imagine the Labour Party beginning to shift into something that could be electorally possible.
I think we might be creeping towards that one vote that wasn't for the Labour Party. I think you're giving me some clues now. Was it possibly the 2019 general election? I
voted Lib Dem because I couldn't, in honesty, bring myself to vote for a Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn, and I certainly couldn't vote for anybody else. My constituency, my MP is Peter Bone, who has a Tory majority of about 24 billion. So it would have, there was no tactical value in voting as I did, but I just couldn't in conscience vote for a party led by Jeremy Corbyn. And it was very difficult for me to do. I mean, I stood in the booth with my pencil over the paper, and I physically had to force myself not to cross the bar. I didn't want to waste my vote because too many people went through too much to enable me to have it. But I just couldn't do it. And so I voted Lib Dem as a sort of mild vicarish protest. It cost me to do it, actually, and I'm not. It was a slightly heartbreaking thing to do because I am a tribal Labour person, and I believe still an electable Labour Party would be. Somebody asked my friend, who's a lifelong communist, who's now in his 60s, grew up in Clydeside in the days when communism was the real McCoy. He's never really changed his view, and he asked me what I was now, and I said I think I'm a Blairite monarchist, which I think horrified him more than if I'd said I'd joined the Phalange.
Which, of course, is a pretty religious and extremist party in Lebanon and fought the civil war there. Let me ask you, your family, just going back to that, your brother had a little bit of a career in politics. He was a Conservative councillor and then still is a Conservative councillor, beg your pardon, and certainly was a Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner. So perhaps political activism runs in the family. Have you clashed with him, or have you clashed with the rest of the family over your different brands of politics, or do you all have a thoroughly enjoyable Christmas lunch?
Well, we didn't have a thoroughly enjoyable Christmas due to various degrees of shielding, but that's not because of our politics. No. Well, this was in the 80s. Well, my brother was always to the left of where you would think he would have been in the 1980s. He was a police officer then in London. And now he's slightly to the right of where I thought he would be as a Conservative councillor in the city of Peterborough. But he's not ideological, actually. He's pragmatic. In fact, we spend most of our time agreeing about what we need to do. And basically, we need to ensure that, younger people have better opportunities, that people don't trash the communities they live in. So as vicar and councillor, actually, we're very much involved in the same sorts of things. And I regard him as an ally in most of them. We disagree about Brexit. But I disagree with half the people I know about Brexit. So I've never found it. My late partner David, he was a great fan of Margaret Thatcher, who to me remains a sort of villain of all villains. In fact, the day she died, we had the worst argument we'd ever had. But on the whole, I don't require the people who I'm closest to think the same as me.
When you say you disagreed over Brexit and you voted Lib Dem, you're giving me a clue that you voted Remain in the referendum.
Yeah, I voted. It was the easiest political decision to make in a way. I mean, I'm not romantic about Europe, and I know enough about it to see that it's an organisation. Our relationship with it required reform, but I just thought it was a madness to excuse ourselves from the European Union when the benefits it brought us seemed to me to far outweigh the penalties, and to do so at a time of economic uncertainty coming out of austerity into a world that grew ever more uncertain seemed to me to be, well, poor timing would be charitable. I still think it was a mistake, although I kind of got into lots of fights with friends of mine because once the referendum happened, it was clear to me that it had to be honoured and that there was no going back on that. And nearly everybody I know was kind of screaming and tearing their hair out and demanding a rerun of the referendum. And I thought that would be, I mean, I believe in democracy, really, in the Churchillian sense of it being the least bad of the alternatives. But I do think that if a vote is delivered, you have to honour the result. If you don't do that, then you risk a functional democracy. And risking functional democracy, that's just simply too much this season at the moment.
My final question, I think I know the answer to this one already, but could you ever see yourself voting Tory for any reason?
No, I couldn't. I mean, because that's an interesting question. If, for example, gosh, that's such a hard question. I mean, I couldn't do it, I think, because I would remember what it felt like to be, we adopted a South Wales mining village in the 1980s, and to see what the government's policies did to that community, whatever the context of the economic viability of coal mining and everything, and to remember what it felt like to be powerless and victimized by policies that were so destructive. I could never forgive it, Tom. And for that reason, I could never tick that box, I don't think. Although I have to say, there have been lots of things that Tories have done that I've rather admired. I thought the interesting that the Tory government brought in equal marriage, although that was obviously built on the work of other parties too, was pretty remarkable. One of the most interesting discoveries in my life was back in the 1980s at the height of the AIDS crisis, realising that the only senior politician who really got it was Norman Fowler, who was then Conservative Secretary of Health. And really having to struggle to admit that there was a Conservative who was getting this right and everybody else was getting it wrong. So I'm not too doctrinaire about it, but I am sort of romantic and passionate about it too.
I think it does, yeah. I think that the short way, although it was a fascinating answer, the short answer was no, which I can understand.
I could never imagine doing it, but never say never.
I've got one task left, and that's to try and sum you up. We define our brilliant interviewees at the end of all of these. But before I do that, I've got to ask you, for the listeners who can't see what appears to be a gold disc hanging behind you in your study, and those are pretty rare things. What is that?
That is a gold disc, which was awarded us, I can't remember when, for a record. I can't remember which record it was. I used to have quite a few of them, and then I was burgled and they were all nicked. And then somebody I'd given it 2 years ago returned that to me. So I do have one left. Interesting, when you play the gold disc, it's not your record, it's actually an Elvis Presley album.
What a pleasant or unpleasant surprise, depending which way you look at it. I'm going to define you. Whoever called you a monarchist Blairite, I'm probably not going to top that, but I'm going to give it a slightly more prosaic go anyway. I'm going to put you down as a spiritual, market-embracing social democrat.
That sounds pretty much on the money. Yeah, I would have to probably see myself in that. Yeah.
We've got that much right. Reverend Richard Coles, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been
Pleasure,
a really fascinating listen.
Nice to talk to you.